Okay, well, welcome back, everyone, on a cold, almost spring day, but not quite yet. But don't forget, you change your clocks this weekend, so you're going to lose that extra hour of sleep that we gained in the fall, but nonetheless, we'll get some more daylight time that comes along with that. So, welcome back. We are on session 5, and for the K to 3 teachers, that was their last. For the 4 to 6 teachers, you'll be joining us one more time when we go through space. And that will be happening in April. So we look forward to that. So to just without any further ado, I'm going to just turn it right over to Ted, who's going to do some of our opening slides, and then I will jump in at the end with some ideas for units. Take it away, Ted.
Great, thanks, Chris. As usual, I'd like to begin our meeting this afternoon with our acknowledgement of land and people. Before I read it, I would just like to play a brief video clip and listen to Stephen Paquette speak on the acknowledgement of land and people and some things maybe we ought to be considering as we hear those acknowledgements.
Oh, all right, come on.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
What I've learned from my elders is that when we do acknowledgement of the land, it's not about acknowledging whose land it belongs to, because that indigenous worldview, we never owned the land. We were simply caretakers of it for future generations. And what I've been taught from my elders is that when we do that acknowledgement of the land, it's much more than just the territory. It's about relationships. It's about our relationships with people that share the land. It's our relationships with Mother Earth. It's our relationships with the four-legged, the finned, the feathered, the crawlers, the original stewards of Mother Earth. It's that relationship that we acknowledge with the trees. It's that acknowledgement that we have with the plant life that is part of the food chain and helps us exist. It gives us our medicines for healing, gives us food for nutrients. It gives us our medicines for ceremonies. We acknowledge water. Water is sacred. Water is life. And what we're told is that when we acknowledge that water, that we always have to acknowledge the carriers of those teachings, which are the women. So we do that in the same voice. We also acknowledge the infinite wisdom of the grandfathers. Then we take that to the next level, is which acknowledging that relationship that we have with father-son, or in some nations, brother-son. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with Nokomis, Grandma Moon, and how she cleanses Mother Earth. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with our distant relations, the star people. So when we talk about acknowledging the land, it's so much more so than just acknowledging what nation was on that. As we know through all throughout the history of Turtle Island, is that indigenous people were for the most part nomadic people. They shifted. They would move from season to season. It just so happens that Sheridan sits on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, which I'm very proud to always share and educate with people. But in the same breath, I also acknowledge that many, many other nations have walked this territory, and that their ancestors are still here amongst us.
So as we listen to the acknowledgement of land and people, maybe might want to be thinking about the relationships we have with those around us, the special relationships that we have now and in the past, and of course, the beautiful environments that we are currently in across Alberta. So in the spirit of reconciliation, we want to acknowledge that this gathering is taking place on traditional lands across the province of Alberta, home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We acknowledge that this land is a traditional meeting ground, giving voice to its original peoples and the story of creation of this country in a way that history has forgotten. So with that, once again, welcome everyone. We hope that in this session number 5, that we continue to help those who are piloting develop some of that confidence, direction, and efficacy that's needed as you unpack a new curriculum and a new course. For some of you are doing the entire program. Some of you are just doing 2 or so organizing ideas. So we hope that these sessions do help provide that support and that and the resources that you need to move in a positive direction. Our agenda for today is quite similar to the other sessions we had, in the sense that the front end kind of looks at the framework, the meat, or the bones, I guess, of the curriculum and how we can look at it. And then Chris does always a wonderful job of providing lots of examples and resources that that fill in the pieces and really give some life to the course. So we look forward to that. So even though my part looks like it just used up 4 of the 5 points there, Chris is going to take up the whole second half of this, and maybe even more today. We'll see how fast I can go. So that's what we're going to be looking at, or basically a quick look at the cusps and through the organizing idea of energy. This is the first and only organizing idea in the grade 6 science curriculum that has 2 outcomes. And they are identified there. The first one deals with more the physics and answers the question in what ways interactions lead to physical change. So we investigate interactions and changes from forces. And the second outcome deals with investigating and analyzing those various energy resources. If you had the chance to look through the entire K-6 curriculum, you'll notice something different with this curriculum than in the old curriculum. In this curriculum, the organizing ideas from grade to grade, or the units from grade to the grade, are connected, and information from one and ideas from one is transferred into the next. And there's sort of a building block approach and spiraling approach with the deepening of the understandings and concepts and skills. You can see, we can go to the next slide, Chris. From K to 3, we're taking a look at movement and what movement is and some things that affect it. We begin looking at force and how force affects movement by grade 3. Through grade 4 and 5, we're looking at how non-contact forces affects movement, and grade 5 is looking at flight, and grade 6 is really taking a deeper look at the interactions between objects that lead to change. So many of the concepts that were covered in grade 3 come back in grade 6, but we look at more of the internal changes and the internal things that can happen from force. So definitely a building block approach and a huge connection there. And that's where the idea of transfer comes in. Many of the skills, such as the ability to investigate or analyze and so on, begin at a young age and they move up through the grades. A lot of the concepts, as I mentioned, do the same thing. So, and it does make sense because at the end of the day, transfer is probably our collective goal. That's what we want to do. We want kids to take what they learn from one class and move on to the next. I've been in classes where I know I've taught some classes and the teacher of the next grade upgraded to me, "Hey, did you teach this?" And I said, "Yeah, we did." And maybe we've all experienced that, or we go, "Geez, didn't this teacher teach that last year?" And of course they did. But we've got to then maybe take a careful look and say, what can we do in our classrooms to transfer? So we're going to look at the cusps through by answering the questions, what transfers and how they transfer. We know that skills and the procedures associated with them transfer. We can see, for example, collaboration in a variety of contexts, and collaboration can be transferred to many contexts in many situations. So skills and procedures transfer. Besides skills and procedures, concepts transfer. In here, we can see, for example, the context of courage or independence in each of those pictures. And so as concepts, they do move from place to place and time to time. And related to concepts are understandings, which are created by concepts. They transfer from place to place as well. The next slide will show that if we take an understanding, the bottom one is the grade 6 energy understanding, which is an interaction, includes internal and external forces that can affect the shape, size, position, and or movement of objects. We could probably explain this photo through that understanding. We also have different understandings from the different grades that those students from those grades could also take the same photo and provide their understanding at that grade, at that level, and interpret that photo through that particular lens. So understandings transfer as well. Next slide, please. This next slide is just a little graphic about that same idea. Knowledge in the curriculum in this particular curriculum includes facts, symbols, rules, principles, and concepts. Those are included in there, and the understanding part is how they're all put together. And so some of those facts and things come together in a statement, and that becomes an understanding. And then the skills and procedures are what students do. It's the do verbs, the skills and procedures part, which is also transferred. So let's begin with a concept and the knowledge column Those of you who have heard this presentation before know that concept is just an idea that is a 1 or 2 word idea with distinctive attributes and has a specific definition, in other words. So in all these 4 pictures, you could probably see 2 concepts there. The top 2 photos are books, and the bottom 2 are magazines. And there are certain distinct attributes with each of them that distinguish between a book and a magazine, although there are some similar attributes as well. And of course, concepts have multiple examples across time and space and place, and that's what makes them transferable. One other thing to point out with concepts, I think keeping this in mind does help with maybe our planning. The broader and more general a concept is, the more transferability it has, and the more abstract is likely as well. But if we take a look at the fairly general ideas of energy, movement, and force, we can certainly look at that in our science curriculum, which we're doing in the energy unit, and examine how those work together and why they work together and the interactions that happen. We could also use that in phys ed and wellness, for example. We could look at energy, movement, and force in there, or other subjects, perhaps drama or dance or something like that. So the more specific, though, we get, the less transferable and the more depth and understanding you get of the particular discipline. And so there are some concepts that are just so specific, they just stay with the discipline, but the depth and deeper understanding of that discipline happens because of those deeper and more specific concepts that are understood. And concepts are really good to provide a focus. In this image, for example, you can look at it, but if I asked you to look at it with the focus on lifestyle, you might notice that it is a farming lifestyle. You can see a farmhouse on the top. But if I asked you to look through the lens of climate, you would notice some other things. You'd notice that there probably is a fair amount of precipitation there. Things are quite green. There's lots of trees in the background and so on. So depending on so I guess concepts at the end of the day do provide that focus for us when we want to have that focus. And that's what we're going to do as we look through the 3 columns, the 3 cusps, is using concepts as the focus. So let's take a look at the lens of concepts first. In this, you can go. I have the slides on the board, but we'll just jump right to this slide. I've highlighted all the concepts just in this 1 cusp line and the 2 lines for the guiding question and learning outcome of the first outcome. Those are the ones in purple. And you see something interesting when you do that close examination and look for those concepts. You'll see some become repetitive, and if some are used more often than others, such as forces, objects, and forces, internal forces, external forces, change. You could see that, and physical change, and you could see those ideas show up in the guiding question and learning outcome as well. So when we put them all together and examine everything, here's what we come up with. In this particular, we can go to the next slide. In this particular organizing idea, with both outcomes, the key concepts for the first outcome is force, external force, physical changes that happen as those forces and those objects interact, and interaction. And we could have put object in there as well. When it comes to the natural or the energy resources learning outcome, of course, energy resource is a leading concept. We take a look at things called factors of use. In other words, we can have a list of ideas or things that are considered to be factors when we're using it. Other concepts that show up are resource management, our needs and wants. What are some impacts? What is an impact, and what are some examples of impacts with resource use of energy resources? What's the non-renewable resources is in there? It's a mistake. That's a key concept from the other grade. But we know that how energy is used or how we access it is also a key concept in this particular learning outcome for this grade. As I mentioned in a previous slide, that concepts have definitions and examples. The definition of the concepts are located in that knowledge section. And I didn't make the correct changes on these. But in the grade 5, thrust is a concept and it's defined there as well as, but sometimes they are not defined there, and we do have to take a look. In the slide deck that you get from us, I will make sure to have the correct grade 6 slide in here. And hopefully I've changed the next slide. I don't recall. The next slide, please. No, I didn't. But in this slide, you'll often find that there's a list of examples of things. So in the grade 6 curriculum, for example, there is a list of factors that affect the use or should be considered for the use of natural resources. And then they give a list of examples of possible factors that should be considered. So examples of the concepts are often located here. And if not, we have to sometimes search for them ourselves. Oh, there we go. Go to that's a grade 5 slide again. We'll have to get rid of that. My apologies. Okay, well, I have the right slides now here. Another thing to keep in mind about concepts that they do become related to each other. You can connect them up with other ideas. And when we do that with this organizing idea and this first outcome that looks at force, we can sort of make a bit of sense out of the whole thing with just pulling out some of the basic ideas. So, for example, we can read this at forces in the middle, and we do know that I guess start with interaction. Interaction between objects, which can either be contact or non-contact, creates a force. And we see the different types of forces that can be created in terms of if there's a contact or non-contact force. Some of the forces then can be considered external, internal, and so on. There's different types of forces which are identified there. And of course, the different types of forces can produce different kinds of change, which is the fairly large chunk of this organizing idea, changing of the shape, size, position, or movement of the objects. And shape can change of shape as a result of plasticity or elasticity. And the next organizing idea, you could do the same thing with it.
I'm just going to make one comment on this one, and we're going to see it. So when we go through this particular concept web and the next one that Ted's created is really one that you should probably grab right up front and use, because you're going to have to bridge. You can't start the grade 6 outcomes and just launch into them, because the students will not have the background. And the terms that you're seeing here this is not their first time. So there will be a significant amount of bridging that needs to happen before you kind of launch into those discussions. Sorry, Ted.
No, absolutely. Because a lot of those aren't defined there. They assume that students know some of those because of previous grades. In the energy portion or outcome for this organizing idea, we do focus on energy use, and you'll see sort of 3 big arrows coming off of use. We're looking at factors that are considered when using energy, and the ones that are the factors that are probably expanded the most are accessibility. Like we use energy directly or after processing or more indirectly. Another factor to consider is land resource and responsible management. When we're talking about responsible management, we are talking about land resource uses, disruption to the environment, and so on. And that is connected to, if you look at the green line with factors to consider when using resources, we have to consider the impacts and some of those environmental impacts. And that, of course, is connected to how the resource is managed. The impact is going to depend on the management. And so the third thing is that our use really is defined by the needs and wants. And we know that when we examine our houses and we take a look at our lifestyles, there are many, go ahead, you can keep going. There are many reasons and things in our world that use energy in different ways. So let's take a look through the idea of understandings now. That sort of covers the knowledge piece and the concepts. I just want to take a moment to just restate the definition for understanding from the guiding framework, because it's in there. And as we pause and really try to see how it's structured and what an understanding is, it could be a tricky one to maybe instruct towards and maybe assess. So understandings are how facts and knowledge, which again comes from the knowledge column, how those things fit together in a logical and meaningful order. So just to provide an example of that, we'll go to the next slide. Excuse me. I have 5 concepts there, and individually they mean certain things. Some of them are taught from the from this particular grade 6 unit. Other of these concepts are ones that have moved up from grade to grade, but by grade 6, students should know these 5 individual concepts and their individual meanings. But we go beyond that. When you put them all together, something happens. You create a different meaning, I guess, when you put them together. We take a look at the first statement. movement of objects can affect the external and internal forces during an interaction. So, or we can make another understanding of that. An interaction includes internal and external forces that can affect the movement of objects. Movement should be highlighted. They have two different meanings, but again, using the same concepts. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll see that that's what the understanding is. That's where those ideas appear. You'll notice in this particular understanding, I limited it just for the sake of example, but we can do that with the understandings and investigate them one at a time. So an interaction includes internal and external forces that can affect in my example, I use movement, but we could also affect the shape or the size or the position of objects. What that understanding does is gathers all the knowledge pieces and puts them together in that logical and meaningful order, which is the understanding. But to really demonstrate that understanding, you need to know what those knowledge pieces are, right? And so in the first cusp and second cusp, all the individual concepts are really defined in those particular, in that column and for that particular part, and they're brought together in the understanding here. That's an understanding. And they do transfer. We could take that same understanding and we could see here we have two different contexts where an interaction that includes internal and external forces can affect the shape, size, or precision and movement of objects. And if the movement of water is as a result of force, and the change of this egg is the result of forces as well. We can go to the next slide. So really briefly then, we've just covered that concepts have definitions, and examples and are transferable. We know that our concepts are deepened through the grades, as we've seen through the matrix, and concepts keep moving up and getting a deeper understanding of them. They can provide a focus, which we consider was a conceptual lens. And finally, concepts, when they're put together, have a relationship with each other, and we can put them together in a statement, and that statement becomes an understanding that can also be transferred. And just a quick peek at skills and procedures in that third column. If we go, maybe I'm going to ask you, first of all, to go right to that first link at the underneath skills and procedures. Yeah, that one. What I did was I took all the skills and procedures here for both outcomes, and I highlighted them with different colors. As we know, the skills and procedure has the skills, or the verb part is the skills part at the front end, and then the content. What I did, because when we take a look at these, there are so many different verbs and so many different things that it's kind of hard to decide what it is the focus is. And so what I did as an example here is I grouped them. Anything in blue, all of those outcomes, or not outcomes, but those skills and procedures lines can be addressed if we just spend some time and take a look at what an investigation was, the steps in an investigation, because they all consider those things. So you'll see the first skill is investigate. Well, that makes sense. But the second skill is plan and conduct experiments. An experiment is just a type of investigation. And one of the steps in an investigation or experiment is to plan. So those things are built in already. And again, you could see that the second one I divided up into red. Well, really, we want to make sure we have the safety procedures done. That's not part of an investigation, but something we expect kids to be able to do and to demonstrate. So that has to be done separately. But then again, while experimenting, so like investigating. Second one, conduct investigations as well. You'll notice there's some green highlighted things. And what those are really is students demonstrating their understanding of specific concepts. So identify the forces. And we know there's different forces. We call it a contact force, a non-contact force. We call it a torsion or a bend or whatever force we're using. So they're identifying it at that point. And that's a conceptual thing. Here's an example of a twist. Here's an example of a break, and so on. But again, during a specific interaction, we could probably include that in an investigation if we wanted. When we're analyzing the next one, again, that's in an investigation. It's one of the steps in investigation. So to simplify it really quickly, when you scroll up again to the very top of this page, please, Chris, you'll see that there's really three things that we really have to work with kids, and that's in terms of demonstrating understanding of concepts that we'll talk about later. But there's two real procedures or things to do in this part, is to get kids good at investigating and getting them good at safety. Investigations, we'll see, has a lot of sub skills, but that's to help focus on, that's what we're going to be focusing on for this. That's what I would unfold it and focus on for this organizing idea. And similarly with the next organizing idea, Chris, let me just scroll down. Again, I kind of grouped some things. There's a bit more in here. There's a bit more. We could see that the bottom one, the blue ones, investigations, they're part of this as well. They show up near at the end. But this is very conceptual and knowledge-based unit. There's not much for the experimenting that can be done. There are a few that can happen. But this is a very one where they do a lot of discussing, perhaps the investigations to be more of research-based investigations. And you look at them closely. They research, they don't use the word research, but in some cases that might be the best way to get some of the information they need. And so you'll see there's one thing called design. I'll talk about that later. And of course, some of the green things, which is again, just demonstrating their understanding of certain concepts as they go through the course in different ways. So there we go. So if we go back to the other slide, then what I've done is just sort of isolated, when we take a look at the really big key skills to focus on for this organizing idea, investigations is certainly one of them. I included this research and collaboration because when we're doing those investigations, some of them, especially for the energy one, may involve research. And to know what kids need to do at research, if you go to the competencies, you don't have to go to that link there, Chris. You don't have to go there now. There's some benchmarks that are provided for you for what kids in Div 2 should know when it comes to research, or be able to do when it comes to research. So that could become part of your teaching there. Same with collaboration. So when they're planning and designing things, you might want kids to collaborate. And what should kids be able to do with collaboration by this grade? And same with comparing and contrasting is another one. One of the the skills and procedure statements did ask that Alberta's compared to the rest of Canada when it comes to energy use and distribution. And finally, there's one thing where they showed for kids to design something that uses some kind of an energy thing. And that really is to get that design process, you have to go to grade 4. So if we can go to the next slide, Chris. They're on the slide for you, but if you go to the grade, go to the next slide after that. Oh, I see. I have the wrong slide. I forgot to eliminate a slide. We're good. When it comes to grade 4, the design process helps kids come to the end of a creation process. So even though it's computer science, at this grade, they're still working with designing things, not just necessarily computer coding and so on. So you can see a design can produce things like objects, and you'll see that designing experiments. Well, that's where they plan their experiments in the process and so on. So there are that's something you could look at when you're getting kids to create and do one specific thing where they're building something that uses different energy sources. Next slide. One thing that I didn't do, Chris, I'm going to have you quickly go back to a couple other slides because I have some slides out of place here. You stop there. If you go to the investigating piece, you'll see a link under there. That would be an important thing to take a look at because it does identify the steps in investigation in here and what's expected at each grade level. If you went directly just to the grade 6, oh man, I even have the wrong, I'm going to get you back out of there and go to a different slide altogether, Chris. I'm sorry. Okay. The slide should have been eliminated.
Okay.
Go back to this previous slide. Right. Yeah, go to the link where it says grade 1 to 5 under investigate there, please. Hopefully that'll take us to the right one. My apologies. I have it titled wrong. Nope, I got the wrong link up there. Anyway, I'll just point it out to you. Grade 6 what grade 6 adds on is a real close look at hypothesis in terms of computer science and how to build a strong explanation. So at the end of your experiment, you're explaining something as scientific knowledge, but the steps of a scientific investigation go back to grade 2. They're actually identifying grade 1, but they're shortened in grade 1. But grade 2 is the last grade that identifies the steps. So you could see the 7 steps there. When it comes to grade 3, that's an important one as well to look at, because it talks about the different types of investigations. So you can have a descriptive investigation, which is based on describing and looking. It could be the research, it could be observing things that happen in nature, so on. The comparative investigations compare things. And of course, the experimental investigations, that's where we're looking for cause and effect. When you get to grade 5, they introduced the idea of experiments with variables. And so when you're planning your investigations, please do take a look back at here. And I'll make sure that when you access your resources later through the website that Chris will talk about later, I'll make sure that all grades there's the correct sequence of grades in here. So anyway, so do take a look at that, because that'll help you design your investigations for your students. Very quickly, in order to, we can keep on going, Chris. That's the design step. So we know that the concepts, understandings, and skills transfer. The question is, how do we get there? We take a look at Hattie Fisher and Fry's stages of learning, and we go from deep to surface to deep to transfer. Surface is where we learn really the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts, the individual concepts, the knowledge pieces. What is the skill? What does comparing and contrasting mean? How do we kind of practice those skills at that surface level? When there's some competency and understanding it with the concepts and the skills, we can move on to the deep. And that's where we tackle the understandings. We take a look at the 3 concepts. We ask kids, well, what's the relationship between these 3 things? And we explore that relationship and that understanding at the deep level. And then we can put understandings together as well to create even broader understanding. And then we move into transfer. And transfer really is where we use a lot of, hopefully kids are independent now with what they're doing. If you're doing investigation, they can be very independent with it, or if they're doing any other skill, they're independent with it. And they're applying their understandings independently as well, in a very novel and unfamiliar context as well. Next slide, please. In order to determine, really quickly, there's a lot of instructional approaches that you can use at the different levels. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm going to just ask you to look at analysis if you can, Chris, at the very top. Right. So if we're working the surface level, we know, hopefully this is it. We want kids to know what an analysis is, because they're going to analyze something. It's sometimes good to do that analysis part first. And this is just the lesson steps. If you haven't done a concept attainment lesson, the steps are provided there. But really briefly, if you're not familiar with it, it's giving examples and non-examples of the concept and asking kids to come up with what is the essential attributes or the meaning. What is that concept? So if you can quickly go through here to the next slide. So here's a photo. We asked the kids to say, look at this photo and take a look at these 3 statements. 2 of them are an analysis, 1 is not. In this particular case, the analysis reads, roadways create patterns, or roadways take up much space in the environment. What is not an analysis, it's difficult to drive in a large city. We go on to the next slide. And you can see the same pattern going, an example and a non-example, what an analysis is. And as we go on, and you can keep on going, Chris, we're not going to go through this all together. At the end of the day, then, this one's kind of what happened. So analysis, go ahead, go to the next slide. I shouldn't stop. I'm running out of time. I could talk too much.
You're all good.
Then you try to give kids to say, okay, we looked at those examples and non-examples. You should have an idea of maybe what they are in your mind. Where would you classify these? Which of these statements is the analysis? Statement 1 or 2. And at the end of the day, statement number 1 would be the analysis, because it does what analysis, it has the qualities of an analysis. So if we go to the next slide, we'll find that out. Analysis is simply a conclusion that has been made after careful, close examination or study, using certain criteria or a lens in order to understand that something better. And if we go to the next slide, then we can have kids just quickly practice it. So So there's some practice that happens after that. And so this is just one way to introduce a concept like that. And you'll find on that sheet, if we go back to the main slide deck, Chris, you'll find on that main deck, I have analysis, cause and effect, observation, a lot of those things to develop those particular concepts at the surface level. All right. It doesn't mean that they're going to learn it right there. They're going to get a good start there, but we have to keep on using that concept, having kids applying it and finding it and making an analysis and so on in order to be good at it. Now, I have those particular ones there because those are key concepts to understand and know about when they're doing investigating and experimenting. So at the surface level, we develop an understanding of certain concepts, but also certain skills. And you can see at the bottom, I have the direct teaching of thinking skills strategy, just one way that you may want to introduce skills, those particular skills, if they've never done them before. So investigating, for example, does include observations. It doesn't include an analysis. It includes conclusion making. It includes prediction making. It includes understanding what investigation is. And so you'll see those show up on those list of steps for investigating and to find out or to help students understand those concepts and the steps before you go ahead and teach it. You can use some of the links found here. So they'll all be there. So that's at the surface level. At the deep level, that's where we want to tackle those understandings. And so quite often what happens is you get them to do something, compare and contrast or evaluate something, and you have them apply that, what they've just learned through that activity to the understanding. And I'll give you an example with that, how to do that in a second, but there are some instructional approaches that are really helpful for that. You can go to the next slide, Chris. Many of you may be familiar with making concept maps. It's really helpful when you get kids to put certain concepts together in a context, and then have them explain that concept map. That's a really good way to get kids so they understand how the concepts are connected. When you're doing a lot of activities, it's really good to ask them those questions. So what's the relationship between this, and this? In this particular case, if we were to take a look at a grade 5 example, what's the relationship between thrust, drag, and movement? We know what thrust is, drag is, but movement is another thing. If they can talk about how they're interrelated, they've got that broader understanding. Next slide, please, Chris. Related to that, and the slide previous to that was talking about conceptual questions. And conceptual questions are just, again, asking a question using the concepts in the question for the students to ponder and think, well, how are those all related? What does that mean? What meaning can I get? And so if we take a way to do that is to take your understanding and just switch it into a question. For example, there are several factors to consider when determining the use of energy resources. That's one of the understandings in the second outcome. But if we turn that into a question that perhaps maybe we know that there's a lot of investigating here, and every experiment or investigation begins with a problem. Well, let's make that the problem of the experiment or the investigation. Is energy use and distribution in Alberta as compared to what is energy distribution the same in Alberta as compared to other provinces? What factors of energy use appear to be the most significant in Alberta and in other provinces? And those are all based on the knowledge that they would have had previous to looking at this understanding. So if that becomes the problem, there's the understanding, we turn it into a problem, and then we can go to the next slide, Chris. And then we can turn it into an investigation. So before they run and do this investigation to examine that, which would probably involve a lot of research and so on, they need to know all these things on the left-hand side. It's going to be a comparative study because if we look at the skills and procedures, there's examined energy distribution and use in other provinces and compare it to Alberta. So this is an investigation. We know that one of the types of investigations are comparative investigations. So we get kids to compare and contrast. And on the sheet that had the list of surface level instructional approaches, there's a skills teaching approach for comparing and contrasting if you want to take a look at that and get your kids familiar with that if you're going to use this approach. So the understanding would be an investigation. You'll see a link at the top there to an example template. You don't have to go there now, Chris, but that breaks down. It has a list of all the steps. It's fill-inable by the kids. And it's a template that would fit a grade 5 or 6 investigation. And there's another link that would help with that. It's just an information base that you may want to get kids to that can a good starting point for this type of investigation. And then off they go to the races, collecting the data that they might need. After they do that, and they've done their investigation and so on. And remember, their question was based on the understanding. So their conclusion to that investigation should be the understanding that we're looking at, which is that there are several factors to consider when determining the use of energy resources, because that was the question. Are there? There are. To deepen that understanding even more, what we could do is have students put the words together or the concepts together from the left-hand side, cut them out, give them the individual ones and say, can you put this together in a concept map? And if they can do that and explain that to you, again, that's deepening their understanding and deepening and demonstrating their understanding of those particular concepts. There's certainly more we could add on there, but we want to keep it small if they haven't done these before. So that's a really powerful way to get kids to demonstrate and what they know, and it helps you let you decide where some misconceptions or some misunderstandings might be. And finally, after we deepen all that understanding, they know that we go to transfer. And this is when you give them, again, they're good at investigating now, and they're good at looking at things on their own, a little bit more independence. We now find a different context to look at the same understanding. Let's change it the context, though. So an example on the next slide is there for you. We know that in Quebec right now, there's some lithium mines being proposed and happening. And this is just a brief little 5-minute video on some consultations that's happening to build this mine in Quebec. And the question then becomes, how does this video show that there are several factors to consider when determining the use of energy resources? And again, it's just helping kids deepen their understanding that that's what has to happen when we use energy resources in this particular case. And finally, the last little bit here. To move from surface to deep to transfer, there's a lot of that assessment that has to happen. Chris mentioned that, again, you have to go back and when we were looking at that concept map, make sure kids understand some of those ideas in there. Well, that could be part of your pre-assessment. If you know them good, if not, then there's some pre-teaching to do. Then we do some formative assessments to make sure they got it, and so on along the way in between each one. The next slide shows some example questions that you can ask as to if your students are ready to go from surface to deep, and then from deep to transfer. So any of your learning activities can be really good assessments as you're watching the kids work and listening to what they're doing. And we use that triangulation. We'll know by focusing on these kinds of questions with the assessment focus whether they're at the right stage or not. And another thing you do is take a look at your skills and procedures. Go ahead, Chris. This is a new slide I added. I was talking about. You can see that a lot of the skills and procedures can help. You can slot them into where you're at. So if you're doing the skills and outcome statement, identify the forces that are acting on an object, that's at the surface level, right? You're still working that specific concept of those particular forces. And we go all the way to the transfer thing here. Now they're planning and conducting experiments. Now you notice that this is more of the independence thing. They're planning the experiment themselves and conducting it. And so if investigation is one of the key skills, then we keep on doing investigations till they can have the ability to do that planning part by themselves. So in a brief nutshell, that's where we're at. And now I've built a bit of a framework. And now Chris is going to really add on the really fun nitty-gritty stuff that's really going to help to make this come alive for you. So thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Are there any questions of Ted before we launch into another slide deck here? Just unmute yourself at any point. Okay, so as Ted said, we're going to just maybe unpack some of the pieces, but what I want to preface for you right up front is this is, and we said this with the grade 5 group yesterday, and we alluded to it in grade 4, but it really built from grade 4 and up, actually grade 3 and up. the potential of this particular organizing idea could very easily turn into a definition opportunity here. And we're really guarding against that. We want to just really put that up front to you, because if you even go to your curriculum document, you just got a definition after definition listed there. And if that's all they're going to get really to start off with, I mean, for one, it's not very engaging, but secondly, just copying that into my notebook doesn't really transfer any kind of understanding to me. So just want to put that right up front to be careful about how we tackle some of the terminology. Now, that being said, you'll notice that it's called Forces and Resources Part 2. If you were to go to the grade 5 folder, you'll see Forces and Resources. Because really this grade 6 organizing idea for energy is a culmination of everything that they've actually already done. You're just going to go really deep into it. And so it is absolutely incumbent on us that we have to backtrack here and spend some time doing what they've done from grade 3 up, in some cases, definitely from grade 4 up in others. And so in this slide deck part 2, I've actually grabbed for you from those other grades the key pieces that you may need, right? And it could be as simple as showing them a video. It could be as simple doing a pre-assessment with some terminology first and finding out what they know. So you could skip through some of these because you find out, wow, they already know all this. That's great. But I would guess that they won't, because this has never been the way science has gone for them in elementary. It's been kind of that, we called it science in a box. You know, you did your box in your grade, and then they moved on. And it wasn't until they got into junior high that we started to unpack some of those again and start tying them together. So just that preface right up front, I just want everyone to be really clear on that, and just to really emphasize it. When I look at kind of how we would unpack what's happening that's new, the red is new, right? But I can't do the red if I don't have this kind of background knowledge at all. So the bridging for this 6 organizing idea is very, very much so in your face, and you really have to do that. Now, how you do that, and I've said this in sort of all of them for organizing ideas. I mean, in some respects, the organizing idea of energy here has actually been kind of exciting. And for me, it's been exciting doing the research for finding new sites that you can use. But I'm also not a here's notes on the board person, never have been, never will be. I do like students to have a question up front, or, you know, what's the difference between a speedboat and a rowboat? You know, like, what's the difference other than one's got a motor and one doesn't? There's some other things that are happening there. And as I start to unpack those differences, I bring that terminology in. So it's kind of as a on learning, as we culture it, I'm going to start bringing it in. And that would be really appropriate for this particular organizing idea, really from grade 3 and up, to have that kind of an exposure, just because there are so many terms. And not every term is going to be important to every child. And so again, I say to you, how do you see yourself unpacking this? Like, what is the end product that you want them to do? And how much choice will I have as a student? So maybe some of the terminology isn't actually imparted by you, and it's not actually learned directly by me. Maybe it's done from a group that's done through a case study, and they share out some of that work, and then I'm starting to learn some of those, and then you're jumping in. So again, you need to kind of think, how do you feel comfortable? Like, what's your comfort zone in these, and where do you see sort of your interest level? Because our interest level is going to also affect what we can kind of grab and see and do forward here. So for example, you really do want to know what they know about forces. Do they even know anything about push and pull? Like, do they have any kind of basic understanding of what a force is? So this is coming right from some of the grade 3 materials that we did too. And this link that you have in here will take you right to some very elementary levels, but some really fun things in there about forces, right? And I had said, if I was going to start this off, I wouldn't even tell them what we're studying. I would just go to the phys ed room, grab the biggest string that we have, a tug of war rope, and take them in the gym or outside if it's nice enough, even outside with mitts on, and just have at her. And then why aren't we moving, or why are we moving, right? Or why are we sliding? I mean, that would even be better if they were in snow, so that if you've got one side that's stronger and they can't put their feet down, they've got no friction to build there, they just slide along in the snow. There's just a wealth of conversation that I can bring into that right away to start saying, you know, what do we know about forces and what happened out there? And how come you guys kind of got dragged right through the snow right off the bat? So just having that kind of a conversation with them right up front would be a great way for them to go. One of the things that I had in the slide deck too was, you know, let's do some activities. And even though they might be older students, put them on a tricycle. Yeah, their knees might be up to their ears, and that's a little bit of fun. But again, you know, what do I know about the little tiny little wheel that I have to pedal around versus I might have a, you know, a mountain bike that I have that I go to school with. So how does that compare? And how is the force that I have to push with my mountain bike with gears on it versus, let's say, this little tricycle that they're going to do? And they'll have a lot of fun, set up an obstacle course in the gym with just hula hoops and pylons and everything, and they've got to go through it and have a race. But there is a great conversation piece again that we can have about friction that comes in. All of those terms, they've already done in theory if everybody had landed at your doorstep having done the new curriculum already. So this is really why we're saying you need to be kind of consciously aware of maybe the pieces that need to be embedded first before we do that. So again, contact forces, we define what those contact forces are through the applications of different kinds of examples that we take them through. So pushing and pulling, what is friction? How do I slow myself down? What if I'm on the swings outside at recess time and they're still not too old to be out for recess? How do they speed themselves up on a swing? How do they get themselves up nice and high other than having somebody push them? How do they slow themselves down? They put their feet down, right? So that's that friction and the contact. But those are things they do every day. They just have never maybe connected the terminology and the understanding of forces to what they're doing, right? So just bringing that to light alone is just a great way for us to even review what's tension, what's the elastic kind of force that we have. And again, I had some suggestions in here that things you might want to do, and just having an elastic bite, if you feel comfortable with it and they're not going to absolutely do some damage to each other, bring in a bunch of elastics, some really tiny ones and some medium sized, and then some really long ones. And then how does that change when I stretch it and I let it go, right? And do the big ones automatically go further? Not necessarily, depends on how well they pull them back. You know, those are fun conversations, but they're great ways
Hi,
for us
kids.
to engage in the kinds of things that they need to know prior to us jumping into grade 6. So here we kind of get into the grade 6 portion, because now I can have a conversation about, we already know what the forces are. We know all the definitions of them. We know how they get applied. We know where they might get used. So what are internal and external forces? Just the terminology of internal and external, tying in all that other terminology is new to them. And so this little video is actually a part 2 to one that we already looked at. And it just talks about what are the internal and external forces. How do we define them? What does it look like? Gives them some everyday examples and some demos that you might see. And then you might even just want to say, you know, where do we see them? Do anybody have any examples that they can think of, you know, that we could use for? Look around your surroundings. Can you find any examples? Could you find anything of an applied force? And that was the nice part about this video. And that's why it took me a while to find these, but this one has all of our applied forces that are in the grade 6 list of definitions. It has it in here. And so you might even want to stop it after she does the first one on an applied force, maybe stop the video and just unpack a little bit more and then find some examples that you can name and then go on. I mean, you don't have to do that video the whole day, but she unpacks all of the terminology and then some in there. So this is a great way to tie into the grade 6 curriculum, but not necessarily just straight words and definitions. Identify external factors that are acting on structures, right? How does a bridge have an internal structure? Why do we say that a triangle is one of the strongest different supports that you can have? What are the forces that make a triangle such a great shape, right? And if you think about it, if you have a table with 4 legs on it, the chances of you having a wobbly table are high or possible. But if you have a table that has triangle, 3 legs on it, it is impossible to have a wobbly table. It will not happen with 3 legs. So, I mean, kids might say, well, then why don't they make all the school desks with just triangles, right? Good question. Why not? Probably has to do with the supports that we need. But this is a good one for them. And we used to do a lot of that in the old junior high, even in grade 7. So in the absence of knowing what grade 7 science might look like, the grade 7 science used to have them build a structure, build a bridge, build something that could support. We would do activities in the gym where you bring in the supplies and say, now that you understand things about structures and about forces, here's the tools we're giving you, a couple of bags of glue or whatever you've got for them or tape. What can you build, right? And can it support whatever option or object that you want them to do? That wouldn't be unreasonable here in the grade.
Hi, kids.
Non-contact forces were talked about in grade 4, and that's important. It's not as important, but they need to know that not everything is a direct touch, a direct push. And so when we talk about all the things that have to do with non-contact, including gravity, right? That's part of the grade 6 conversation. The video from Bill Nye here, he covers absolutely everything in the grade 4 curriculum. So again, if you're feeling that they're a bit devoid in some of those, here would be a great one. It's 60 minutes long. So we said to the grade 4s, grab a popcorn. This is a great one that we could have a little bit of fun, but watch the whole thing, because now I can see what non-contact forces and how they work. And he unpacks those really, really well. When we look at grade 5, they did talk about resources, and that's really where it got unpacked in a super huge way. So again, if they don't understand even just resources, and if we live in Alberta, some people might think it's only oil, right? They're not thinking in terms of other things, because we hear oil a lot in ours and natural gas. So what else is there for renewable? What's non-renewable, right? So those were the kingpins of grade 5. So again, if you're sitting back and listening and saying, oh yeah, no, I don't think we have enough of that, then again, this is the place in the slide deck that you might want to go first and just grab some of the links that are here and just go back and do a little bit of a revisit. Because you're not going to have a very good conversation here if you want to talk about sort of doing a deep dive into how they're going to do sustainability or renewable energy, if I don't even know what those words mean. This one here, again, it's one of those all-encompassing. It covered everything in the types of renewable energy that are around. So it's a great overview. Again, I wouldn't get deep into everything, but again, I need to know what they are before I launch into the grade 6 stuff. So this particular one, Guide to Energy on Earth, is a great one. It unpacked absolutely everything that was in the grade 5 curriculum. There were some resources that I had purchased in the fall, just already thinking sort of down the road of what we might need for 4, 5, and 6. And these were some that we found from Scholastic, and they're excellent. They would be a great way too, if your kids are going to do some further research, if you have these in the school already, or maybe you want to purchase some. There was a set of 4 of them, I believe. So there was wind power, geothermal energy, and then we have the other 2, solar power and water power. And again, these are looking at it from the lens of renewable energy sources or energy sources that we have readily available. What is sustainable, what isn't sustainable, right? We want to talk about those pieces as well. One of the other resources that we've highlighted in the 4 5s and would fit in here as well is a graphic, not graphic novels either, but they're a graphic magazine, not a magazine, it's a book, it's an actual book, but they're soft cover. And what they do is they kind of highlight all of those things that we're talking about right here, but they do it in kind of this comic book form, and the kids are quite engaged in this. I have the whole set of them. I've had them for years, and now they really come back, and this is perfect for them. So even here, like coal, oil, and natural gases are non-renewable resources, right? And it's based on the guy called Max Axiom. He's a super guy, like Superman. And he goes around and he unpacks a lot of the theory and things that are happening, but it's really well done. And it does have a teacher resource manual. This is what this one looks like, renewable energy. So a refreshing look, but there's all different versions of this and different books. So you might want to look at something like that as a resource. This one comes in a bit of a kit though. It has like, I think there's 20 different magazines or books, and they cover a variety of different grades as well. So one of the books that we're looking at too from Pearson, you have maybe got this in your book in your school as well. I'll just go back one here. This one is called Energy by Joe Windsor. It's from the SAILS series, SAILS. Those have been around the schools for a long time. And I would be shocked if some of you don't already have them in your schools. You just maybe don't know them because they're typically were kind of earmarked at grade 3, 4. But they're actually not anymore, especially with what we're talking about right now. And so they too have quite a nice overview of some of the pieces that you're going to talk about in grade 6. But again, it would be backfilling some of the pieces that you might need. They don't go into pages and pages of it, but they just talk about, in this case, renewable energy, maybe one spreadsheet or page to each one of them, so that the kids just get a quick overview. So it looks like this, energy, and the SAILS series have this little thing in the bottom left-hand corner. So maybe have a look in that or ask your librarian if you have some of those resources. So if we've kind of unpacked and got caught up, really when Ted kind of unpacked those webs and the concept maps, those are absolutely incredible. And I think this is where you really want to link those into, because I don't need to, in theory, if everybody landed at my door knowing everything, I would be going on and talking about what factors do we consider when choosing energy resources to use and how we access them. So if I'm going to try and look at what would be a great renewable energy, I need to know something about the energy source. First of all, I need to know how easy is it for me to get it. I need to know, do I have to dig for it? Do I have to burn something to get it? Like, how do I access that particular source? Is it efficient? And if is it got transportation and distribution issues? Like, how do I get it from point A to B? You know, how do I get solar energy for the world? And there's actually a really good video I found for you on that one. Societal impacts, right? What is the change what change would humans be affected by? Economic impacts, environmental. So all of these are things that you could talk about. All of these are things that students could actually do a little bit of research on. Or if you've already said, I want you to think about a renewable energy, and I want you to see if you can dive into these and see how would you unpack and answer these. They might even just do an infographic on those. And this is something that a lot of schools are using right now. Is this kind of a big push on these? Because what it does, if you've never seen an infographic, if you Google them, there's lots of them that are freeware that you can just download a template, and the kids could even go in and do it themselves and download one that they like. But my thought is, if I was going to do this, I'm not going to go through these one at a time with every kind of renewable energy, like, and that would be so boring. But if I get to choose which one I want to focus on, and I'm going to unpack these, the infographic is like a poster paper that you're going to post up, and it has all of the information concisely put together. So now the kids don't get to write pages and pages and cut and paste. They've got to be really deliberate about how they organize the thinking, but they also have to address all of the pieces in there. So it's a fun way for students, but a very targeted way to learn. Like, they have to be thinking about how they're going to present it. So that brings in some competencies into that, right? How do I do research? How do I do my communication? In this case, my communication will be through the infographic, and how do I present that information? So there's a lot of stuff that's in there. The other thing that I might do as well, and this definitely would be me, is I would be unpacking some of what are things that are words or terminology that's typically associated with an extraction process, right? What would they be looking and what would they be reading and what would they be seeing? And I would be building cards for that. And then I would have cards that would be linked to each one of these, and I would just give them a card sort and say, here's a bunch of terms. These are your header cards. Can you match the terms that would fit under those, right? And some of them definitely will fit into more than one. So again, it's another formative assessment for me to see, do they really understand what these were all about, right? And are there some that I gave you on the cards that, haven't seen those, don't know what this means? Well, that's a good one for us to have a conversation about, you know, or even doing this up on the smart board or the whiteboard and having the kids come up and do them in groups. So that would be another way to unpack these, but also to link it directly to whichever one that they're working on. Again, these are just ideas, guys. I'm not saying that this is the only way to do this. Some of the infos that I found for you that would be helpful, especially from the grade 6 perspective, there's one area called, or one website called Teach Engineering. It's excellent. It gives you a lot of resources that you can access. It also gives you a lot more than you would ever need, I guess is what I want to say too. But when we talk about resource energies and systems, you have here what is, first of all, what are we talking about for resources? It'll talk about the learning objectives. These ones actually fit very well with the grade 6. It's based on, this is a US one, it's based on the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards. I really like those. I've been following that since they updated them. There isn't an outcome that we couldn't find in our curriculum that isn't in the NGSS. I mean, their science across the world in education has the same outcomes. Just what umbrella are they falling under? But what I do like about NGSS is that they support teacher, PD, and student learning through a ton of resources for the teachers to access. And so you pick and choose what it is that you're going to focus on. So they have worksheets, and no, I'm not saying go crazy in worksheets, but these are not worksheets in the sense of just a black and white fill in the blank. A lot of these will be talking about a different resource. They give you even PowerPoints already that are linked in here. And in one case, I did link one in because it was really good. But they give you, and you can see I'm talking about fossil fuels. They'll show you how they changed over time, and they give you the graphs. So for you to find resources to put things together based on how you want to unpack it, I'm going to say to you, I think this is a site that you would really, really like. It gives you ideas of how to start. It gives you ideas for motivation. It gives you the lesson backgrounds. It'll give you vocabularies. A lot of them are ours anyway. And it gives you some ideas for assessment. What might I use from those lists? So it's a great little tool that you can just sort of access right off the bat. Just Energy is another one for you that I would suggest maybe having a quick peek at. Just Energy is actually like an EPCOR, right? It's not in Canada again, but it's one that's just a company, but the company produces educational resources. And so when you come in here, the one I like this about is, why would I want to use that alternative form of energy? And what factor might I have to consider? Hey, that's just right where we're going with grade 6, right? So also, what's the difference between when you hear alternative energy and renewable energy? What's the difference? There are lots of similarities, and some people say they're one and the same. Well, you might want to read this through. There are some subtle differences, and it goes not both ways, right? You can't flip the terms around both ways. But then what are the best types? That's that factor piece that we just looked at, right? What's the most affordable? What's an efficient one? What's one that's most reliable? Yada, yada, yada. So there's all these different components in here. That fits really, really well with the grade 6 one that we're just about to unpack. And then project learning is a really kind of a cool one. It has, again, some resources in here, but what I really, really liked in here was that it had a bunch of different activities, game formats that you could play for alternative energies. Like, I don't want this all to be about really good research. We want to have a little bit of fun with that too. So can they connect what they've learned to go through some of those pieces as well? So there's some games in there, but here's the big one. What are the pros and cons of primary energy sources? Right? What are the factors? Why would I choose this? So they would click this one on, and there's my factors right there. It'll bring a whole slew of things up for you. One thing that I forgot here in that Teach Engineering, they have a really neat game. I did highlight this one because I went through it in detail. It's about, why would we even want to care about renewable energy? And in Alberta, this is a good game to have a conversation about, because when we talk about, would fossil fuels ever disappear? And there are some certainly mixed messages that come out on that and mixed feelings. But this game is just a simple brown bag and a bead game. They explain it to you. But in the process of playing the game, they're taking beads out, which is basically saying I'm extracting from the earth. And what's going to happen at some point? I'm a country. Okay, Ted's a country. He's got his brown paper bag. I'm a different country. I have my own brown paper bag. And we might not have the same beads in each of our bags. And so when I keep pulling my beads out based on what the game is about, I might look in there and realize I don't have any oil left. Now what? Now I have to go over to Ted and negotiate whether I can get it from him. How do I get it from him? Do I have to build a pipeline? What effects might that have? Yeah, you get the idea. So that's a really good one for you to have a look at and just see what you can do with that. Again, just an idea, but I get excited over games like that because that starts to get kids thinking about what happens. This is from the grade 5, but I've included it because, again, depending on what they choose to do a research on or how you want them, maybe they want to build a turbine. Maybe they want to build an efficient city. How would they build an efficient city? How would they power their city? What would that look like? What forces inside and outside would they have to consider, right? So those are other pieces. So again, this is a heavy page for resources for you.
Around the world.
So some possible transfer ideas, and these are just throwing them out, and Ted gave you some really, really good ones. And I just jotted down that you might want to go back and have a look at his slide 27 and his slide 46, because those two in my mind were really powerful for you looking at what you might want to do with the students later on. So that was 26 or 27 and 46. Have a look at those two slides, going back to those. But you know, what's a simple transfer? You done any baking lately? Made any bread? Let's make bread. What do you do with bread? You mix it. You've got some internal factors that happen, and yes, they're chemical, but you're also kneading it. You change its appearance, you change its form. It changes its form when it starts to rise. So what's the vocabulary that goes along with kneading? Is there a force involved in that? And how would you describe it using the language that we've just learned in the terminology? What about car compactors or garbage compactors? What are the forces that act in that scenario? So maybe some kids are keen on just doing some research on when you squish a car and you see these big trucks that are carrying these large loads that are carrying these compacted cars. You know, why didn't it just go flat right down as a piece of paper? What were the forces that kept it from doing that? And yet what was the force that was coming down to bring it down to that level that it did, right? So having those kinds of conversations. Or what ideas do they have? What's their interest level? Where do they want to go with it? You can bring all that terminology into just some of those pieces. What would your energy efficient city look like? How would you build an energy efficient city? What would be in it, right? And again, there's no one right answer here, but this really gives them a chance to work as a team in a project where maybe they make a model, they design a model, but in designing the model, and let's say if I'm going to put wind turbines in there, then I need to know which way are the wind turbines facing. And what do I need? How many do I need in our little town? How many people are in our town? Blah, 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 right? I mean, those are the pieces that they could have a lot of fun diving into. And yet they can pick what is of interest to them. So you could even have 2 or 3 groups. Everybody's building into the city, but everybody has a different perspective of how they're going to get into that city and what they're going to add to it, right? What do I do? Again, forces of wind. If you want to build turbine, I live in a community where there's no wind. Well, building a wind turbine might not be the smartest idea, right? You might not have a lot of power. We don't live in a place where we get a ton of sun, right? Or, and again, maybe they want to do a powered vehicle. How do they want to put their solar panels if they're going to do that? One of the videos I shared with you is about sun, and it talks quite a bit right here, the solar power. How might I use that to my advantage to build a city? And how much would you have to make that happen? One of the videos that I watched, I didn't include it because it actually was a conversation with Bill Nye, the science guy, with movie stars. But they get kind of crazy in their conversation, like seriously crazy. But one of the things he said was, did you know that if we took solar panels, and this is really interesting, and covered France, okay, all of France was covered, or one state in particular, I can't remember which one he named, either France or that state. if they were from end to end covered in solar panels, that would be enough power to generate for the world to function. Now, wow, that's kind of cool. So then you think about, well, now we have options of houses, or they're building houses where it's not even optional anymore. You will get 4 solar panels on your outside of your roof. So how much energy will that give you, right? That's a good thing for kids to dive into. How would you harvest that energy? Where do I store the energy? So on days when it's not, like, how do I sell the energy, right? Because that's another thing that's happening. Anyway, enough talking on my part. So that's just kind of ideas to kind of culminate a whole bunch of things that are happening, but how I might unpack what's happening in grade 6. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a starting point, at least, of where to go with it. I'm going to stop our recording, and then I'm just going to share a little bit more info.